Hey, it is season 2 of the Sopranos podcast. Thank you all for joining us. It's a sunny day here in Jersey, and by sunny, I mean drizzly and grim. We are here for episode 1, season 2, Conversion Reaction. How many more people have to die for your personal growth? That is a quote by Dr. Melfi in the climactic scene of the first episode of Season 2. Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office. This episode was written by Jason Cahill and directed by the great Alan Coulter. Boys, we're back. Season 2. Very happy we were able to keep our schedule going. The every other Sunday, your audio Sunday dinner is back for Season 2. I didn't know we were going to get into this, but it's exciting. We're going to jump in like we always do, go around the table here. First thoughts, initial kind of reaction to the Season 2 premiere of The Sopranos. We're starting a whole new 13-episode journey. Paul, thoughts on the premiere?
Oh, it's great to be back. And actually there's an energy that brings us into this episode right away that I love. I love the opening. I love the Frank Sinatra track. And I'll say that this episode surprised me watching it, because I think before and after The Sopranos, there's been a sense that season enders and season openers often have something explosive in the plot, something big happens, either a big blow-off or something new beginning. This episode is subtle, and we're dealing with a dulled edge for Tony, and I think to a lesser degree, Christopher. The two most complicating characters from the first season, for example, are not terribly important in this episode. Junior he's in one image, he has no plot. Livia has been diminished, and so now we have to deal with some of the other characters. We bring back Big Pussy, we bring Janice in, and she's sort of filling that Livia role, of course. And I think most importantly is what Tony is going through. He's in a very interesting, odd place in this episode where he's kind of won the war and now he's presiding over the peace, and it's deeply complicated, and it's leaving him unhappy, frustrated, bored, depressed, and we have to thread out the story from there. And it's subtly done, it's beautifully done, I think it's hilarious at times, as well as dangerous. The scene when he goes off the road is odd, funny in a way, but scary, as we reflect on at the end of the episode in the great scene at the diner with Dr. Melfi. So I thought it was methodical, even deliberately slow at times, but I thought it was a dynamic, fun intro to the new season that brought us back to the core of the show in many ways, even drawing on imagery from season 1 and the pilot.
Well said, Paul. Jordan?
Yeah, Paul, I mean, that was really a perfect description of the episode. I will say that I thought the episode was very big. I thought it covered a lot of topics. I thought a lot of people had their small moment in it. It was just a very large episode. I thought the world had been expanded in a way. It just felt like a bigger piece. Part of that was emotional. Part of that was quite literal. There were some locations we weren't used to seeing. There were some new faces. It did a really nice job with checking in with everybody. I thought, in terms of like a checklist, it really hit all the buttons for me in terms of a premiere. It was quite funny. And to respond to something Paul said, I think we get this sense that, peacetime is in a way worse for Tony. Like, perhaps he's not as good at governance in peacetime as he is in war. So this, of course, brings its own challenges. And, in regular series television, when you have this kind of storytelling, usually this is the time to show off who your season's, big villain is going to be. Like in the first episode, they do something crazy. And actually, Janice is the one that fills that role in this episode. And that's also funny to see from a storytelling standpoint, that the show will continue to go through this sort of atypical plotting by saying, hey, Tony's threats can come on either side of the definition of family.
Yeah. Well said, guys, and I agree. The show definitely has this feeling of expansion, and a lot of shows do this in their second season. I'm brought instantly, if I can make a comparison, to Game of Thrones in a lot of ways, because season 1 felt very much like the Baratheons, the Lannisters, and the Starks. and it's a very personal story. And then we hear about Stannis, for example, Robert's brother Stannis, and we don't meet him until the season 2 premiere, or the first chapter of the book, if you're talking about the books. And so Janice is someone we've heard about briefly, who is now here and immediately a major player. It also expands in many other ways. We meet Tony's lawyer, Junior's lawyer. We have some new fun characters that we'll talk about in Chris's storyline. Carmela's parents, who we haven't seen, and they actually address why we haven't seen Carmela's parents up to this point. They were alienated by the Dragon Lady.
The Dragon Lady.
So I really like this premiere. I think it's a great start. It doesn't fire in like a bang bang sense, but it fires in a dramatic sense, and it really kind of ignites the seeds for what is going to be a really dynamic season of television. So we got 3 plots going on here, or actually I have 4, because one is kind of woven through several of the other plots. But we have Big Pussy's back. We have Christopher running the stock brokerage in this kind of lobistic stock scam. Janice is back and already working as Janice does. And also something that is more of, I don't know that I would even call it a subplot, but more of an undercurrent that comes up is we're getting a sense that Tony and Carmela are really not in a good place in their marriage. That is right. And it made me quite sad throughout the episode. Where should we start?
Oh, boy.
I would start right at the top with the opening.
Yes.
We can check in with everybody.
Montage
talk
is
about
really
the montage.
Cool. It's a great montage, great song. It's well put together. I think, it's a very good year is a great way to signify that A, some time has passed, and B, hey, we had a great first season. So, and also I just like a lot of the imagery we see here. For one thing that's noticeable to me is Tony is playing solitaire. He's the boss. He's on charge. He's kind of alone in his new position and authority. And guys come in with a bag of money for him. I like the repeated gag of all these different things happening. Some things are very different. Livia and Junior's position, for example. And some things are very much the same. Carmela cooking. Every time we see her, it's that same kind of slide shot of her walking out of the kitchen with some delicious looking concoction.
That I wanted to come here and eat with you guys. These delicious casseroles.
We do get the sense that some things are the same in an enjoyable way. We get Silvio just buying some nice shoes, some gangster spectator styled shoes, which I thought was a fun shot. We get Paulie and one of the Bada Bing girls on the table there. Those things are fun check-ins. There are also some quite sad check-ins. We have shortly after seeing Tony with his mistress, we see Tony crawling into bed and Carmela turning the other way. So there's a lot of indication of what is to follow. And we get our only look at Junior in that montage as well, in prison still, just kind of as a reminder. This was like the most artful way of doing like a previously on that they could have. Yeah. As by way of a check-in.
Livia going through the rehab, that was kind of an interesting moment.
It's a nice cut, too, because she's rotating her leg. And it cuts right to the Bing girl with her leg expertly up in the air as Paulie bangs her on the Bada Bing pool table. I also want to shout out, before the music even begins, this short scene, where the young Asian man is taking the Series 7 exam.
Oh, yes.
For Christopher is so good. It's one shot. It's such a out-of-place setting for The Sopranos. It's also a really ballsy move to start this season. This writer's room had to have supreme confidence in themselves and the world that they created, that you not only know these characters, their names, so you know, of course, this isn't Christopher, but you also have to have a sort of shorthand for the scams that they run. Yeah. This is a quick scene. Yeah. To really understand it, you gotta... So they're not spoon-feeding it to you. There's even a nice little bit where it seems like the young woman taking the exam next to the Asian guy is not buying it. She's looking at the guy like, maybe this guy's name is not Moltisanti. But then you're right into the next sequence, and that it just goes all the way through. All these little bits are so nicely done. Tony playing solitaire, as Chris mentioned, is so nice. There's something visually I find in this whole sequence about Tony that's a little eerie. He's always in the half-light. He's usually angled away from the camera. For me, it felt a bit like a forward to how something is incomplete in his life in this episode. He's not a complete mess, but he is at the edge.
He's off balance. That's the word
That's
I wrote.
a great term for it. That's just perfect, Chris.
His equilibrium is all over the place. Obviously, Janice is the kind of person who frustrates Tony and, in fact, many of the audience members of The Sopranos. But to the point that he gets where Carmela has to, be like, relax, go have a beer, please, So that's there. And yeah, I agree. There's definitely something off with Tony. Just to mention while we're talking about the montage too, I love the we get just a little touchdown on the kids and how they're doing. Meadow's learning how to drive. They're growing up. First thing I wrote when I saw AJ was, whoa, growth spurt. He's yeah, it's like somebody
Big
fixed
time.
the horizontal image. It's like he's kind of squirt. He's up and in a little bit, and he's also very 13, 14-year-old fashion, like worried about his shitty haircut and making sure it's perfect. He's thinking about, I can't just be a tubby weirdo for the girls.
That's right. I was going to say, for the first time, he's concerned about his appearance. I don't think he was a character that really looked in the mirror a lot prior to this.
I was wondering what we were going to do now for fun, now that we can't make fun of his Marilyn Manson shirts anymore. Another just quick one, a nice contrast in terms of whatever due diligence the young Asian man presumably did in preparation of taking this Series 7 exam in Chris's name. The only actual shot of Chris in that opening montage is him nursing that love of old gangster movies and doing a line of cocaine. So that will be a nice indicator of what his discipline will look like in this episode.
Yeah, really good. Anything else to say about the montage?
I think that's about it. I think it was a nice way to check in on everybody, including what's become of Melfi and the current, state of affairs between, what's going on in her life. She's out at a hotel, or I should say a motel, like a common prostitute or something. And that was really kind of heartbreaking to see.
Yeah, and it evoked the comment Tony made to her in season 1 where he says, I don't feel like being made to feel like I'm pouring my heart out to a fucking call girl. And here she is in this cheap kind of Jersey, highway motel.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a great connection. All I wrote was that this motel, the setting is humiliating for her. There's like a bottle opener by the door. There's a shitty Monet reprint on the wall. Of course, it's in great contrast to the more elusive paintings in her office. It was, so it looked and felt really rough.
Yeah, she's in Tony Soprano's world now, boy. And then we get right in. I'm going to jump right into this because this is what the show gives us first after the montage. We get what may be becoming a season premiere tradition with Tony walking down and getting the paper. And there's a Cadillac, and I love that they kind of almost mimic the Goodfellas shot when Pussy gets out of the car and it lifts a little bit. Like, you know what I'm talking about, that shot in Goodfellas in the very beginning. And, Pussy gets out, and Tony starts running up the driveway. And, it's funny, my dad, when I watched the show with him, said right away, like, that newspaper thing, he needs to have somebody else do that. That's not a good habit for a mob boss to get in, is walking at the end of your driveway by yourself in a cul-de-sac, But he's down there, he's getting his paper, Pussy steps out. The one thread left hanging in season 1 is what we start with. And then they have a terrific series of scenes. Thoughts on Big Pussy's back? What do we think about this?
Well, I thought the initial meeting between them was actually, very realistic.
Yes.
I thought the writing was, especially good here, because these characters have so much to say to each other, but there's so much danger in them having really any conversation. Tony inviting him into the house instead of not wanting to speak on the street, that could be a dangerous place for both of them. Also, never has the membrane been more thin between Tony's home life and Tony's mob life, so much so that he has to take Pussy down into the basement, where I get the impression in the Soprano house, and I said this in our season 1, that the basement is where Tony goes to have, like, his private ugly time, right? That's where he works out and makes his strange noises. That's where, he watches his war documentaries. That's almost like the transition point between his mob life and his home life. So that's where he brings Pussy down into the basement, down into the depths to hash this out. It's not a criticism of this scene. It was just something that I noticed for myself as a viewer. I just thought, like, come on, Tony, just, you're smarter than this. This is so suspicious. I felt the scene was suspicious. I don't know.
Yeah, they're definitely still suspicious of each other. And another thing,
sure, Tony pats him down there.
He physically and Pussy picks right up on it. And that's something I want to mention because we were talking and joking about in season 1, Jimmy Altieri, who's the worst, most stupid rat in the history of the mob. And here's Pussy, and that is not the case for him at all. He's not stupid. He's a smart guy, and Tony is used to being the smartest guy in the room. Now, I'm not saying that I think Pussy is necessarily sharper than Tony, but he does have an instinct for this in the same way that Tony does. He knew that somebody was onto him. Yeah, I love when he's like, you don't think I know when all my friends turn their hearts to stone against me? Fuck. And you come out my house at 3 o'clock telling me you're my friend, And Tony just has nothing to say to that. He just kind of looks sullenly at his coffee like, yeah.
Sure. Here's part of the problem is that whether Pussy is smarter than Tony or not, they have a 30-year history.
Yeah.
And Pussy is very aware of something that Tony said not in his presence in season 1, which is like, I fucking love that man.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, Tony really loves Pussy, and Pussy knows
I felt
this.
similarly about this sequence to you guys. I thought it was very well done. Vincent Pastore really does a great job and ratchets up the tension. I felt I wanted to pose the question to you guys about what makes Tony, if not trust Big Pussy, let this play out for the time being in this seemingly inadvisable way, as Jordan mentioned. Because one thing that I thought of, there's a line much later in the series, another character says, how much more betrayal can I take? And Tony is coming off of this experience where his own mother betrayed him. And is it that he can't take any more of that? Is it that he wants to, again, as Chris mentioned just a few minutes ago, come back to an equilibrium, which would include Big Pussy coming back into the inner circle? I was wondering about it because something felt suspicious about this to me as well.
Right. Tony doesn't trust him, but he doesn't want to believe the worst about him, I think, because very much like you said, he's just been through an awful betrayal. We get the sense that Pussy's not just a friend, but a great gangster and a good earner. And this is a time when Tony's going to need friends and allies to kind of rebuild after the war with Junior. And, I just think that he's going to check the story out, as we find out in a few more scenes. He has Paulie kind of check into all of it. But Pussy, like I was just saying, Pussy's no dummy. His story, while not fully quenching Tony's suspicions, makes sense. Like, I buy his story on a surface level. He was having the back issues. All of a sudden, everybody's suspicious of him, and he knows it. There's this acupuncturist down in Puerto Rico. It's not something Tony believes, nor should he, but it's not something that's utterly implausible, is it?
I think it is. I mean, this is just my take, and maybe it's not the popular take, but, like, I think the story sounds like complete bullshit. It's like, I had to go to an acupuncturist in fucking Puerto Rico. I got a mistress who's 26, and that's where I've been for all these months or however long it's been. It's too much for me. And I'm not saying that that's bad writing. I'm saying actually that's very good writing. I'm saying that Tony should be able to hear this story and be like, no fucking way. But there's just something about Pussy. He loves him. Yeah,
we're talking about this storyline, so I don't mind jumping a little bit ahead here. But he gets this story. He pats Pussy down, doesn't feel a wire, just blatantly pats him down. Accepts him back, has Paulie check out his story. And then he's still not quite right with like that lingering shot over the grill later on during the cookout is a very jarring moment, and it's a sense that, like, despite everything kind of coming up clean, you pass your background check. Tony knows something's off. There's something deep in Tony that maybe isn't ready to accept it, but knows something's a little fucked here.
I think that's true, and I think that That's a very nice framing of the whole episode, with things slowly becoming more clear, particularly to Tony, about what is happening in his life and where and how he's vulnerable. A detail that I wrote down in my notes in this scene in the basement was essentially about dark instincts serving one well, in a way. Tony's newfound lack of caring about whatever's Big Pussy's back problems are, to me felt connected to what he'll also say in this episode, all this shit about his mother having a stroke. Fuck that. It's what they call a conversion reaction, what we chose for the title of our episode. And I was wondering if Tony's skepticism, which would serve him well in suspecting Pussy, actually comes out of this horrible experience of his own mother betraying him and him becoming skeptical about her own health issues.
Wow.
I think some of it is that, when you no longer trust your own mother, your perception of trusting anyone then becomes so skewed. I think Tony is trying to figure that out for himself because, he's, as you said before, he's very thrown off balance in this episode. This episode is a lot about lacking balance or feeling disoriented in some way. A conversion reaction, a big fucking opera brought on by repressed rage. Couldn't we say that about the entire show and this episode included,
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. I love that. And of course, it's a great reason to name this episode that, because I think that is The Sopranos, not just this episode, but The Sopranos. Very well said, Jordan. Let's move through this a little bit. The very next thing we see is the kind of, while Junior is not featured in this episode, Tony is tying up loose ends. And we see this hit go down. It's sort of like, who's in, when Pussy's back, they're talking like, so what's going on? Who's still over at Junior's crew? And it's this guy we've never met before, Philly Parisi. And we see him almost put through a test. This guy, Gigi, who we're going to get to know more about later on, Gigi Sistone, another first appearance for a character that's going to stick around a bit. And he rides in the car, and Phil instantly is just yammering about just giving everything up, and it's almost as if Tony sent him in with the mission, like, see if he'll talk, see what he says, can we trust this guy, is he a big mouth? And sort of like, as he talks about all this and spreads the rumor, Tony does not want this rumor going around that he tried to kill Olivia. That's ugly, that's some ugly shit, as Gigi says. And Phil does not pass the test, and he shoots him. One thing I want to say about this hit that I think is just very cool and very in line with what The Sopranos does with violence, and the creators will always talk about this, how they try to always have some kind of unique or distinct or interesting element to the violence. They didn't want just violence for violence's sake. And I just thought it was an excellent touch that this hit goes down in the car, and then Gigi's like, like the volume of the gun going off in the car is just a nice touch that somebody had to think of and made this hit, distinct.
It is. It's really nicely done. And also I wondered if, again, as Gigi says to Philly, that's a nasty rumor, maybe you shouldn't spread that around, that's some ugly shit. Again, is there a poisoning in the ear kind of imagery of Gigi's ear hurting, that it's a deliberate kind of symbolic image in some way? But it's a really nicely done sequence. I also like that Philly's wife tells him to remember the pastries.
Yes.
Clemenza style from one.
Yep.
Except he's the one that doesn't come back from the trip. So.
Yeah, part of the gangster oath is that you must keep your mouth shut. This was one of our major themes in the first season. This has now come back with deadly consequence in season 2. The people that are loudmouths, the people that are spreading rumors, talking out of turn, these are the people that are going bye-bye. And this is Tony's basically New World edict, right? Mm-hmm. People talking, no one's going to talk. He's tying up all the loose ends, he's taking out anybody, disloyalty, the rest of Junior's crew, whatever he's got to do. He's consolidating power. That's how he's spending peacetime.
Yep, absolutely. He tells his guys in the season finale of 1, ask now, because this is not coming up again. And he means that, life or death. You're not going to talk about me in my therapy. That's not a subject that's going to come out ever after this moment. So get it out now. Mm-hmm. And Phil is not going to make it under the Tony regime. So he's shoring up his power. He's They give Melfi a call. You're all set. You're clear. Melfi also suspicious. I think another fun note about this little Melfi scene, I believe the guy has in therapy is Matthew Weiner. I think that's a Matthew Weiner who later went on to write for the show and become the creator of Mad Men. I think that's him.
In this sequence, it's Terry Winter.
Oh, it's Terry Winter. I knew it was somebody on the show. Right. Yeah, Terry Winter. That's right.
Chris, forget it. You're fucking fired, man. Get off.
Sorry. That's shameful. I confused two of the...
Someone has disgraced themselves.
Yeah, that is Terrence Winter. Correct. Sorry, I confused my Winter and my Weiner. I was only off by 2 letters. Come on. Anyway. Oh. So that happens, and very cool. And then we get into this kind of new thing. That it's sort of like once Melfi is free from the motel, that beat is kind of that whole post-junior beat is set aside, and we get into the episode proper. Almost, it feels like, and we are introduced to the brokerage, and Chris is like literally sleeping on the job. He's kind of put in here as the SEC compliance officer to scam the shit out of these fixed income people selling this bullshit stocks. This is called a pump and dump scheme, for those of you who aren't familiar with the mob, the way that shit works. I'm not entirely familiar with the exact intricate details, but it's essentially they push this false stock, bump it, and then sell it right before it crashes, that kind of thing. And we meet 2 characters, Matt Bevilacqua and Sean Gismonti, who are...
Chip and Dale. Yeah.
I think they're darkly comic characters, but you're just struck immediately with just how stupid and volatile they are. I think that's the point. And these are Chris's Chip and Dale at the office, as they're referred to later by Silvio. Thoughts on this scene, this little plot thread, and the new characters we've just met?
I was instantly reminded of Brendan Filone from the first season. You know, they've kind of... These are the spiritual successors to just, like, the dumb wannabe gangsters, knock-around guys that will do fucking anything. And boy, oh boy, if your boss is Christopher, who's already such a fuck-up, you've got to be 10 times worse, you know? So, very enjoyable, frankly.
Yeah.
I felt similarly, and I thought there's one moment, that moment when Silvio refers to them as Chippendale. Ray Curto, another one of the sort of elder statesmen of this family, says, fuck me, these kids. So the whole rollout of Succession seemed to feel to me like now these are very directly Tony's headaches, because he's the boss. And as Jordan just eloquently framed out, Chris is dumb and undisciplined enough already in his own right, so how bad are these guys going to be?
Yeah.
So specifically in this storyline, even though it's lighter, there's a lighter touch than what's happening with Tony, it felt like Chris, again, is working on a very similar frustration, where he has actually moved up in the world.
Yeah.
This is a good opportunity for him, right? This is going to be a nice scam. They're going to make some money off of it. He hates it. He hates this office. It's deadening to him, right? So he's acting out. He's shirking his various duties. It becomes a problem.
He talks to Tony in season 1 about the regularness of life being too much. So, of course, he's not out jacking trucks or Porsches. He's sitting in a stockbroker's office. And as far as gangsterism goes, I don't know that it gets much easier or even safer than that. Yet, he can't stand it. He has to get out, go down to shore.
Sure. Speaking of Chip and Dale, of Matthew and Sean, just the fucking beating they deliver to that one poor junior broker, just pouring coffee on this guy, beating the shit out of him, they send him to the emergency room. Yeah. Just very, unfortunately, very funny.
Yeah.
Very funny.
Yeah, the way they dump the coffee on him. You're supposed to push with beer sticks. Sean in his fucking suspenders. I love that look, but he's such a douchebag. It's
As Jordan said, it's unfortunately very funny. There's also that Sopranos light touch to this whole scheme. It could just be the mood I was in when I viewed it a couple nights ago, but I felt like gross about this scheme. About like scamming these older people on a fixed income. I was like, ugh.
Yeah.
But of course it is rendered with a lot of humor.
Yeah. It's great. And I love, like you said too, Paul, I love the mature, like, Chris has grown a little. He's still very low on the totem pole, and he still has a lot of growing up to do, as we'll see in Christopher's last scene in this episode. But it's an interesting change for him to see him giving somebody else orders. It's like he and Brendan were the two young douchebags. Now he has to kind of find a middle between not being anywhere close to Tony level, but also like he has his own. He has to deal with it. I love the little touch that they give when he's like has them break down the scam and then gives them that kind of advice. And just when we think, oh, Chris is maybe growing up a little bit, he doesn't tell him to stop stealing Porsches. He says, make it 2 towns over and give me a taste. I love that little moment. It's a very fun touch at the end of that scene.
Yeah, these new characters also give us a sense of kind of the new hierarchy in the family, and also this godlike idolization of Tony. When can we see Mr. T?
Yeah. Use 2 cap motherfuckers together.
And the very unfortunate scene at the bar where Chris hits Adriana and
her,
she hits back. Yeah, so not all of his growth has been good growth. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I hate that they make me laugh in that scene because it's like he slaps her and that's like a whoa, Chris, what the fuck? And she's talking about him cooking his shit, so we know that he's not just snorting some coke now, he's cooking up his heroin, and she calls him a junkie. And so we're seeing that like these guys, it's important on a narrative level because we're getting a first glimpse that these guys don't see Chris as the ultimate authority figure that they need to respect. He's kind of a gatekeeper for Tony, and right. they're completely pathetic. We'll do all that shit. We'll do his, pick up his shirts, do kill people, do wet work as they call. We'll do any of that shit. But they have to make me laugh by Chris using the Jersey pronunciation of hooah. Yeah. Fucking, like he slaps her, she slaps back. You fucking hooah.
Yeah, go home and cook my dinner.
Yeah, that's where she's going.
Yeah. The constancy that Chris, I imagine, would like Adriana to have is what Carmela provides. Yeah. In fact, as frustrated as she has every right to be in this episode, every image of her in that opening sequence is on the domesticated front bringing out dinner, and at the end of the episode when Tony is down and out, he goes home to her. So
that's right. Yeah. That's a great segue, Paul. Let's talk a little bit about Tony and Carmela in this episode, and then we'll get to Janice and bring it all home. But Tony and Carmela, they're not in a very good place, right from the montage all the way through to the end. Very interesting scene that kind of wedges the beginning and the end together is the scene with Carmela and her parents, who we have not met yet, played by great actors. And
Tom Aldridge in particular.
Yes, Tom Aldridge is, legendary, done all kinds of stuff. And Carmela's mother also played, funnily enough, Lorraine Bracco's mother in Goodfellas. So she does that kind of high-strung mother character. The man hasn't been able to digest a decent meal in 6 weeks, And I love the character of Hugh. Even just in this little scene we get, I obviously can't talk about the stuff we haven't seen yet with our spoiler policy, but that fucking line makes me laugh out loud every time when she sends him to the store for the pears, and he's like, "Is that the dole?" And she stops. I'm not even going to answer this time. They're very funny. But the point of this scene is twofold. One, that Livia has been so toxic an influence in everybody's life that they basically stayed away to avoid having to interact with Livia. So that's one. And two, this whole idea that they float of Livia, it said that Tony would get bored with her. And then we get that kind of sad, lingering shot on Carmela as she's mixing up the cake. But let's talk about Tony and Carmela and where they're at and how this episode plays out for them.
So it springs forth actually from the montage where we see Tony with his mistress, and then subsequently in the montage we see him taking off his clothes, which still smell like he's been to bed with another woman. He's putting them in the washing machine, presumably just leaving him in his underwear, goes up to bed to see Carmela. And, they're turning to face each other, and then she turns away, and that's our first indication that, there is trouble in paradise, so to speak. Later on in the episode, any kind of attempt by Tony to be, physically close to Carmela or, affectionate is kind of spurned. We have, of course, the scene at the party where, yes, as you just mentioned, it is revealed to us that at one point Livia had said to Carmela, in fact, on her wedding day, that Tony would eventually get bored of her.
Jesus Christ.
And
I forgot that it was
as you
a
said
wedding
that,
day.
Yeah, as you said, that lingering shot on Carmela lets us know, the audience, that, like, this is how she's starting to feel. She's starting to feel neglected, and that maybe she's been foolish in allowing Tony to really go out and do what he wants in terms of having other women or another life.
One thing that struck me in this viewing, it hasn't really happened before, I thought for a minute, does Tony think that Carmela is stupid? Or, let me rephrase that, does he not seriously underestimate how shrewd a North Jersey woman she is? Let me get this perfumed shirt off, and then my wife won't wonder why I'm crawling into bed at 4 a.m. I mean, come on. And so beyond that, we also see, as Jordan mentioned, Carmela pulling away a bit. Also, I think being so shrewd in knowing, before I think Tony even does, that he is off balance. That scene, great scene, at Livia's old house.
Yes.
When he starts ragging on these kids, Tony's violence in this episode is awkward and impotent. He's gonna round up these kids.
Yeah, I wrote how funny an idea that was. Like, he's gonna hunt down these local high school people, and what are you gonna do?
Exactly, yeah. And so Carmela calls him out on it, even though he's going from this kind of emotional resonance and this anger to saying a moment later, I've been in a great mood lately. Carmela says, yeah, right. So she knows, and there is something neglected, there's something frustrated, but what's interesting about that line, that kind of haunted line from her wedding night, when Livia said, Tony will get bored with you, the last image of the episode to me seemed to suggest that Carmela is actually the one you want around when shit gets bad, but also when it's boring, because she's constant.
Yeah.
So that was my reaction.
This storyline kind of has a little button in the final scene of the episode, which I want to wait to talk about until we get there. So I want to shift this conversation into two other important women in Tony's life that we're just meeting for the first time. Huge appearance for Janice, or Parvati from the West Coast, and from Seattle. And Tony's other sister, Barb, who is not all that far away. I wrote down where she's from here, but I can't find it in my notes.
Brewster.
Brewster, right.
Which is upstate in New York, a little bit?
I think so. Yeah, it's not terribly far from Jersey, but far enough that it's a bit of a deal to have a visit, which I think is very deliberate on Barb's part. So this is interesting. I'll talk about Barb first because there's less to talk about there, and then we'll really dig in on Janice, our new character. But God, Barb seems so normal, and it's funny because she did the in between. Tony stayed with Livia and me, as we talked about in depth last season, didn't understand exactly. He kind of had these rose-colored glasses about who Livia was to a certain extent, and the sisters got it. Barb got it and pitched in financially, but nope, I'm getting the fuck out of here. And Janice, of course, goodbye as soon as she could. So, what do we think about this dynamic here with the three siblings together? We have everybody assembled, and then let's really dig in on Janice here. New character, big character.
My impression of Barb, from the little bit we get, is that because she's the baby of the family, there was not perhaps as much pressure on her to take care of Livia or to have this responsibility that really should fall on the eldest, or in this case, Tony, the eldest male. I think Barb is smart. She understood what the situation was, as you said, and she, got really into it with her new family. This happens to all of us when we get married to someone. You kind of have a moment where you evaluate what your relationship is with your own family, with your spouse, and with their family, and there is a little bit of an opening or an avenue to, not divorce yourself from your family, but put in some distance there. And if Barb felt that Livia was a toxic presence, which evidently she did, she has this opening now in Brewster to get away from the family a bit, which seems to have really worked out for her. And in the reunion scene between her and Janice, I mean, they acknowledge that they were kind of fine with Tony handling everything up to that point because Livia is so toxic. Janice, as the eldest sibling, really had the born responsibility to take care of Livia, but obviously couldn't take it. And yeah, it fell on Tony. I feel quite bad for Tony, honestly.
Yeah, thoughts on Janice, Paul? Janice is here, and she's from Seattle, and she has a fancy pillow got stolen, and she's making miso soup in the Soprano kitchen.
Ergonomic.
$300 pillow, which we're gonna fucking pay for.
Oh my god. So many funny lines. Here's one that I think is funny. The following sequence of events happen right on top of each other. Tony sits down in the back of the Bada Bing with Hesh and another new character named Neil Mink, his lawyer, favorite of mine, really funny. And Tony, they're talking about the new headaches of the federal indictments and XYZ, trying to limit his exposure to Rico boo-boos, as Neil Mink says. And Tony says the following: "The only way to run a family these days is bunker style. Peer out through the slit. Phone rings. Janice is back." I mean, this is not an accident. And I also don't believe it's an accident. Again, these dark instincts possibly serving you well. Tony's mistrust of his own mother now translating pretty directly into a mistrust of Janice, which might be in some ways technically unfair, but not unwise, as we'll learn more and more about Janice as we go on. I like that they have that scene by the pool. The pool continues to reflect the dynamic of family and how tenuous it can be. I thought this whole episode was a really fun intro for Janice. Also, Aida Totoro, I just want to do this shout out because this character is so fucking annoying.
Yes.
But this is a really top shelf performance.
Oh.
And when these two characters go at it, when Aida Totoro and Gandolfini are on screen together, it's fire.
I wanted to talk about that, Paul, because, yes, Tony and Janice are two very different people, obviously, but they have such... James and Aida have such great chemistry as these two characters, even just right off the bat. Like, wow, that makes sense. And I think I want to bring up that these two actually starred, if you can picture this, those of you out there familiar with it, I think it was in the 90s, starred in Streetcar Named Desire together. Think about James Gandolfini, Stanley Kowalski for half a second. And they, I don't know if they knew each other before that or if they became close through that show. I'm not entirely sure, but I imagine that their chemistry together in that was a natural fit. Somebody was like, oh, Tony and James and Aida Totoro will kill this together. I don't know how far back they planned that casting, but it was really inspired casting, and so much to come from this performance and this character.
Do you think there was always the intention to bring Janice in as a character? Do you think that's something the writers had planned in season 1, or is she just something that they decided to say, like, hey, what if she came in all of a sudden? I don't know.
Interesting question. I want to say that they maybe didn't know that Janice was going to ever appear. They certainly mention her, and we see her briefly in the Down Neck episode from season 1 as a child, but I don't think anyone involved in the show even had any inkling there would be a season 2. So I think once they knew season 2 was coming, it was like, okay, what can we do? And I think bringing Janice in for season 2 is a natural decision given how things turned out in 1 and where we are now. But no, as far as like, I think that was like, okay, well, Let's bring in the Soprano siblings. See what happens here.
Yeah.
And then she's trying to prevent the sale of the house. We don't know enough about Janice yet to know what her end game is here, but we know that she's definitely playing some kind of game, just based off of Tony's distrust of her and the fact that the real estate sign, she pulls up in Livia's car. What is Janice working at here? Yeah,
the show goes out of its way to make her seem like a foolish character, one that we should not maybe take very seriously, in a way that's specifically very opposite to the lifestyle of the North Jersey Sopranos. I mean, ergonomic pillows and miso soup and calling yourself Parvati and all that stuff. I mean, she is very counter to the culture of the Sopranos, so we automatically actually have a distaste for this character. because she not only opposes Tony's agenda regarding Livia, but because she kind of opposes this way of life that we're accustomed to kind of enjoying when we come to visit the show. So it's interesting from that perspective as well. I think we all have a distrust of Janice for those reasons.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I also felt a bit like, of course, like so many of the characters that we know, she's essentially running a scheme, or a number of schemes, but just as Jordan pointed out, they're a little haphazard, they're not very sophisticated. Perhaps even though the character seems to invite our suspicion and even our dismissal, it's more, again, perhaps reflecting on how Tony has had this trauma of intimate betrayal from his mother. It's more what Janice can bring out in Tony. As Carmela points out, like, what do you care about this? But there's old wounds, there's resentments. Tony can't resist going and looking and peeking in at what she has in the car.
Yeah.
He could just leave the garbage at the side of the house and go back to his party and, quote, have some pleasure. He can't leave it alone.
Yeah.
And that is going to add to the emotional lability and the lack of balance and equilibrium that we talked about.
Absolutely. Very well said, guys. Anything else on the topic of Janice and this kind of sister storyline?
Yeah, when he gets the phone call that Janice has come in from Seattle, he is actually pretty quick to, invite her to stay in his home and maybe to have a prolonged stay in his life. I think part of what's very painful about these early episodes of Season 2 is that you can see that Tony does want a connection with his family, even as we'll get into with Livia, which is so complicated. So despite whatever misgivings he might have about Janice or whatever past trauma he might have from his relationship with Janice, and it doesn't seem like she was always a great older sister, he does still want her in his life. Tony leaves a lot of doors open even when he says that they're closed.
Very well said. I only have one shout out. This is just a funny line. Carmela's mother, who hasn't presumably seen Janice in several years and knew her as Janice, says, "Parvati, she's a cheese now?" And she says, no, I guess she was thinking of Havarti. And
Parvati.
That's what she was looking for. And Carmela says, no, it's a Hindu goddess. And she says, nice for her. But I just thought Parvati, she's a cheese now, is a funny line.
Oh, yeah. No, this episode had a lot of very funny lines. One line I liked that I want to point out and reference much later in the show, but I just want to... Janice's reaction to Paulie when she first sees him into the backyard made me kind of cock my head and smile. Yeah. Paulie Gualtieri, Jesus, isn't he dead yet? I'm going to put a button in that for a much, much later podcasting episode, but just very funny. So, very nicely, let's talk about how this episode kind of crescendos, which is with this Tony driving. He's listening to Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple. He's having a little fun with it. And then the CD starts skipping, and we get a little Frank zap, 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 and he starts slapping it, motherfuck, and then he starts getting like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, and boom, car crashes shortly after he is confronting Melfi in the diner in what has to be the breakaway scene, the star scene of this episode.
Yep, that's the best scene in the episode. Yep.
So let's talk about it. This is in a show that started in a therapist's office. We've seen Tony without it for this episode. We've talked at length about how he's kind of off balance, his equilibrium isn't quite there, and he's feeling a lot of things as old doors open, new doors open. What do we make of this scene? Let's break this diner scene down.
The first thing that I think of is that a diner, as much as I love diners always seem like a foreign location to me. It's like the place you go to when you're on the road, you're out of town, you're on the run, you're hiding from someone. And then in comes Tony, and you see Melfi, she's like halfway through her meal. The great Lorraine Bracco performance here, where you see how physically threatened she feels by him. He grabs her arm so she won't go anywhere, won't try to scream. That is so
all cutlery stays where it is.
Yeah, so frightening. And, she is like in full fight or flight mode in this scene, and he is trying to talk her back from that ledge, and for one of the first times in the show, he doesn't succeed. It's a really good, really real conversation, because there's nothing he can really say to make it okay for her. She's been so violated. She has a patient that has died as a direct result of his actions. They've committed suicide, so that is more blood on his hands. Again, I'm remembered of, Tony is like death come knocking. He causes death everywhere he goes, even he doesn't even realize it. Death is incidental around him, and Melfi says, "Get out of my life." And, he does give her this final sad look as he walks past the table, and it does seem like that could be it. The show could conceivably end their relationship there and just say, "Nope, Tony fucked this up, too bad." It was a very real episode, real in how guarded she is and how defensive she is, and also real in how genuine he is in his pleas for her help that he does not get.
That's a really nice deconstruction of that scene. To bring it back to what led us to this moment, obviously, Tony slowly unraveling through the episode, and then that wonderful scene that Chris described, smoke on the water in the car, and something that I really am embarrassed to say I connect with, getting absolutely enraged at inanimate objects that fail to produce the technological response that I need.
I may have been close to that reaction myself before recording today.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, the fun Sopranos irony of once Tony has crashed the car and passed out, the song kicks back in.
Yeah.
Following that, in fact, immediately following that, Tony visits another therapist in a rustic office, unforgivably wearing this all denim outfit. And that...
Terrible.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. That whole scene seemed to me to kind of show a negative to really understand the positive of something that we mentioned a number of times through season 1. This was more than just a relationship between a patient and therapist. There was a deep connection here. There was an uncharacteristic trust that Tony placed in Melfi. Here, there's none of that gentleness. There's none of that trust. Tony easily lies to the guy, even though the guy doesn't quite buy it. And that points us to this last scene of kind of, as Jordan mentioned, Tony's last stand in trying to bring Melfi back into his life. And she pushes him away, says that line, "Get out of my life." And of course, our pull quote, "How many more people have to die for your personal growth?" I think, again, is something Tony has wrestled with, will continue to wrestle with, his relationship to other people and his effect on the world. And I just want to bring it back to, I'd say, 2 shots that kind of frame the episode for me. At the beginning, Tony calls her at the motel and says, "It's over, it's safe to go home." And she is outraged and upset. "Have you been following me? Is somebody watching me?" That sense that we talked about a couple times in the first season, that someone, something is watching. And there's this really nice shot where she opens up the door to the motel room and looks out and is wondering about being seen. That shot is essentially recreated when Tony walks out of the diner at the end of the episode, and it pushes in on him, I guess, looking out at the road, now finally out of her purview.
Yeah.
It's a great twin set of shots, I think, about where this relationship has gone. And as Jordan mentioned, this really could conceivably be the cutoff point, which importantly, Melfi is the one who makes that decision.
Yes.
Not Tony. I will say, however, that could be the final image in the episode, but very deliberately, it is not.
Yes.
Tony goes back to his house and finds the comfort of home and his consistent wife.
I want to talk about that in a second, but the last thing I want to say about that scene in the diner, and again, it just speaks to the former intimacy shared by Melfi and Tony that we've discussed at length, is beyond that of a normal doctor-patient relationship. The scene structurally, if you looked at the lines on paper and didn't tell anybody it was a doctor-therapist, could almost be a breakup scene for a relationship. Where that was a different time for us. Lines like that. And Tony saying, "All right, I know I don't deserve your help." Might as well be, "Look, I know I don't deserve a second chance." We've seen the scene before, but it's just it's familiar, but it's very different, which speaks to, the dynamic of Tony and Melfi being familiar, but also very different for a lot of reasons. And then we get into, let's talk about this. This is one of my favorite sequences, personal favorite. Obviously, the Melfi scene is the standout, but one of my personal favorite sequences, because this is something that you will only see on The Sopranos, is this last scene with Tony and Carmela at home. It's just, I love it so much. It's gorgeous in its willingness to just be still and slow and quiet and show two people just living at home. Nothing remarkable happens here. She heats up some pasta. She rubs his back. She comments it's a little weird to see him there that time of day. He eats. She goes through mail. It takes forever, but it gets me sad and also happy because it's so good. But let's break down this last scene here. What do we think of this?
Well, this is, Paul has said this a few times now. This is, the calm center of Tony's life.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he's in a good place because he's able to come home and to have Carmela there with him. And perhaps if he had things more together, if he was a little bit more stable, he would see how important this part of his life is and how he needs to focus on this. Chris, you said it really well. I so appreciate the slowness of this scene and the time that they took, and how Tony does not even seem to know where to stand or how to be in that moment. He's so lost. But eventually he comes to settling down, and I think that's really important. Carmela knows what to say to him. She knows what to do. She sees him standing lost in the kitchen. Well, what's the key to Tony's heart? Hey, I'll heat up some pasta for you. Why don't you sit down? She's accommodating. Do you want something to drink? Do you want some cheese for this pasta? He says no, but he does ask her to sit with him, and she does. This is kind of a settling down. He thinks, what, if I can't be centered by Dr. Melfi, perhaps I can find my center here. I think it is a somber scene, but it is hopeful.
Yes. Yeah, it's a mix of a lot of things. It's sad because he's searching for something that he can't grasp, but it's also hopeful because they both kind of soften for each other in this moment after a very tense hour for them.
Both the opening sequence and this episode, the scene that ends this episode, are framed by music. Both songs have a theme of time. But the first song, the Sinatra song, is a broad expanse of time over one's life. If Sinatra's life is any indication, then the way that you look at that life is a number of passionate love affairs. Time is on my side, the Rolling Stones song, looks at time differently. Time is on my side, you'll come running back to me. And Tony comes home to Carmela, and that is where he finds that calm that might not save him, but as Jordan mentioned, something is sad, but also of comfort and hopeful in a way that this woman is there for him. Again, as we said at the end of last season, you want Carmela in your corner.
Yeah, very well said. It's a beautiful episode, beautiful start to what is going to be a classic season of television, and I'm excited to cover it with you guys. Any final thoughts on Guy walks into a psychiatrist's office before we wrap? Professor Hugh?
Yeah, I think, Carmela admonishes Tony in saying that he needs to get back to therapy. I don't know that he can function without it. I think he is seeing that his life really falls apart without having that in his life. We see that when he tries to go to the other therapist and tries to connect with this gentleman in some way. It does not work. I think a lot of this languishing and directionlessness that we see from Tony in peacetime is because he does not have someone to sharpen him in the way that Melfi does. And I use the word sharpen very purposely. I think he's never more focused about his life and what he needs to do and about his direction than when he's left one of those therapy sessions. So it's, Melfi is like his whetstone in many ways, though I don't know if she realizes that in quite that way. So I think that's the thing that's going to be most important to him, is finding something that is equivalent or in getting her back. So that's what we have to look forward to.
Something that I liked about this episode, and that I did not think was an accident, was that it drew on a number of things from season one, and specifically imagery from the pilot. His going down to pick up the newspaper, the way the episode revolves around / leads up to big family gathering, barbecue. But again, as we've mentioned, Tony has taken Baghdad, and now he has to fucking run Baghdad. And in some ways, it's even worse. And there's new problems, which I think, as I mentioned last season, these new problems will give this new season a different character. a feel of its own. No disrespect to Uncle Junior and Livia as characters, terrific characters, but we can't just repeat the same beats with them. So we're finding new depths with Big Pussy. We have a new character in Janice, and the question of what will happen ongoing in Tony's mood, his inner life, his quality of life, and the question mark hanging over Dr. Melfi will guide us through this season.
Amen. Great stuff, guys. I agree. I'm very excited, and we're not done with new characters. There's a lot of great stuff about to come. This season is expanding into new territory, as we will soon find out. I'm pumped. Glad we're back in business, boys. Let's keep it going. Woo. This has been the Sopranos Podcast. I'm Chris D'Amato.
I'm Paul Mancini.
And I'm Jordan Hugh.
And we will see you next time. And we will definitely not resuscitate you, because it is Do Not Resuscitate, Season 2, Episode 2. See you next time. If you like The Sopranos Podcast, please follow us on social media. At The Sopranos Podcast on Facebook, Sopranos Podcast on Twitter, and The Sopranos Podcast on Instagram. To email us, hit us up at thesopranospodcast@gmail.com. Please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening to The Sopranos Podcast.